Boardroom Bound, Episode 80, The Secrets of the Board Director Search, with Nicole Sandford.
What are the things that you're passionate about? What are the industries or the issues or the initiatives that you really want to spend your time focusing on? And kind of work backwards from there, because I think what people sometimes forget is, this is a real job. You're going to invest a lot of your time into serving on a board.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Nicole Sandford. She was a partner at Deloitte, where she was the founder of the Deloitte Center for Corporate Governance, which meant that she was working with large global companies to transform their boards and their organizational governance. And she also basically invented diversity initiatives for boardrooms. Fantastic story. Can't wait to share her knowledge and experience from that and how it translates over to where she's working today, where she's basically continuing to try to accelerate board diversity. So much information from someone who's been there and done it with all of the leading companies. Let's jump into today's show. Nicole Sandford, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Well, I am delighted to have you on the show today because I have in many ways followed your career. Some of what you did previously is great material that I've been reading, and I've seen it in the press a lot. Very excited to talk about that, and I know that then translates over to what you're doing today and the value you're adding for your clients. And obviously it ties back in with the episode that we had with Janice Ellig before. So it's a small world after all. Everything comes full circle. Maybe we can just set the scene for today, but how did you get to the position you're in? Let's sort of back it up and go a little bit through your career trajectory.
Sure. So I joined Deloitte pretty much right out of college as an accounting major in college. I joined the audit practice and spent better part of a decade working on high technology clients as the audit partner, ultimately working up to being the audit partner for a number of very complex public companies, which was an amazing opportunity. But then I had an opportunity to join the national office in our management development program. And that's when I first started getting interested in corporate governance. That's sort of a program that senior managers are invited to participate in, and you can go in and develop additional technical skills or do something that's aligned to a strategic initiative at the firm level. And since I had been doing so much technical work in my audit practice, I really wanted to do something completely different. And so I jumped at the chance to help our then CEO of the audit practice look at our relationships with audit committees. And this is back in the early part of the 2000s, so really very cutting-edge stuff that we were doing in advance of Enron and WorldCom and all the scandals that sort of made corporate governance very, very interesting. But at the time when I joined that group and working on that project, that really wasn't clear what we were going to be doing for our clients. But
so Nicole, the impetus wasn't the dot-com bubble blowing up with companies not necessarily running the business the way we'd think. It was just sort of separate from that?
Yeah, so it was a little bit of that, and I think there were some new listing standards that the stock exchanges had put out at, sort of around the same time. And I think the idea was that the relationship between the auditor and the audit committee would evolve and change as a result of those listing standards. And quite frankly, the CEO of our audit practice at the time didn't really see that evolution happening as much as he had expected. And he wanted to understand, what could we do to help our audit partners build those relationships, deepen those relationships directly with the audit committee, which now is really just the way we do business. But at the time was something that we were really, a cultural shift that he was trying to help us to make as a firm. So it was really all about how can we get that two-way communication going. It wasn't uncommon at the time for the CFO or the general counsel to really be a gatekeeper between the audit firms and the audit committee, and you had to work really hard to sort of muscle in to have that open dialogue. Thankfully, that world has changed, and we don't really see that much anymore. So that's how I accidentally fell into corporate governance. But after a couple of months working on these projects, that's when we saw the Enron scandal sort of changed everything. And suddenly, all of our clients wanted to know, why are we not Enron and Deloitte? Why are you not an audit firm that's going to get us in trouble? And so my attention shifted towards helping the firm navigate through that crisis, and ultimately led to the development of the Center for Corporate Governance, which today Deloitte operates as the Center for Board Effectiveness.
And let's just unpack that for everybody, because it was a scary time back then. And for some people, it felt like the world was ending, and it did for some people. Lots of companies went bankrupt, lots of problems, yes, including one of the big firms. And what was that actually looking and feeling like? Because obviously Sarbanes-Oxley went into effect a little bit after this, but you could see what was going to happen. So suddenly fiduciary responsibilities changed for a board member. There are some people like Carl Icahn, the corporate rater, who talked about what it used to be like in a boardroom. Of people would show up once a quarter, they would read the documents on the plane a little bit, and they would sit there and read the newspaper during the board meeting, and that's all they did.
Right.
It's not like that anymore. It was changing. There were people probably nervous about it. What was it like at the time for you?
Well, it was really interesting because when I started my MDP rotation, I could read everything worth reading about corporate governance in, the span of a couple weeks. There was very little guidance that was being provided to board members on how to do their job well. Of course, the NACD existed then and as now is a fantastic resource for publications and information, but there was very little besides that board members could really access to say, how do we actually do our job? And I think what happened was board members saw the speed at which the Enron scandal unraveled the entire company. And people started asking a lot of questions, like where was the board? How did they not know what was going on? And my sense was at the time that a lot of directors really got a wake-up call because they really felt strongly that they probably wouldn't have recognized the warning signs either, because it just wasn't expected that the board would dive in at a deep enough level to really oversee a company that was as involved as Enron was in complex, transactions, derivatives, financial instruments, all that good stuff. So, and of course the related party transactions and all the things that kind of led us to that point. I think a lot of directors saw themselves in that board, which was a very, highly respected group of people on that board. So that's why I think it really shook corporate directors to their core, because they knew of these people and they probably saw themselves reflected in the board of directors.
Interesting story about that I heard recently. The CFO kept a running Excel file of all of the individual transactions, and each one had all of the details, including being signed off by the auditors, and everything was factual to the letter of the law. Of course, we would all argue that maybe it wasn't in compliance with the spirit of the law. The file was named Truth, and it was basically of like, look, I did everything that I had to do. So it was wonderful to look back. Now we can almost jokingly see that the file was named Truth, but the standard is so different today. Our expectations as a board member about who we are, what we're supposed to do. And I would love your thoughts on this, because back then, when the board would get together, you'd have 12 very smart people around the room who were very careful about not crossing the line into management's business. They did not need to be in the day-to-day. They would ask some good questions, and that was enough. Today, boards have very different expectations, and trying to find the right level of involvement probably varies by company, certainly by industry. What are your thoughts? How do you guide people through that?
Yeah, well, certainly that is my experience as well. Back in the early part of this century, board members were selected based on their ability to help market the company, to bring some gravitas to the company as it was executing strategy, and really market-facing was the way I would think about how directors were chosen at that time. Certainly that has shifted quite a bit. And now what's really expected is that you should represent the company in a very positive way in the marketplace and help the company to drive its strategies and build its relationships when possible. But that is really not the primary responsibility of the board, and really never was. It's just that the board now has a whole different, I think, understanding of what their roles and responsibilities are. And I think there was a lot of concern sort of in between then and now. There was a lot of concern that you'd get to a point where you'd have these very compliance-oriented boards that would weigh down the company with checklists and analysis. And there's a lot of fear about that as this evolution happened. And I don't know that I've really seen much of that. I'm sure it certainly happens, but I haven't really seen much of that. I think that board members have really been able to step up to the new standards without paralyzing the company and without becoming overly compliance focused. So some of those early fears, I think, didn't really come to fruition, thankfully.
Well, in terms of board evolution, that was a very important part that you talked about there, but I would think probably what most people consider today the evolution of the board is probably the hot topic. The word diversity is usually thrown out there, and I tend to think of it as diversity of thought. So we're not just talking gender, minority representation. You want people that have been in other parts of the world, different backgrounds, different ages. You need diversity of thought in order to really innovate and get ahead. Diversity was not very normal back then. Diversity might have been, well, we'll have some CFOs in addition to CEOs. They're probably pale, male, and stale, and we just accept that for what it is. You were working on that before it was a thing. I would love to hear your thoughts on how it started and how it gained momentum.
Yeah. Well, it's actually an interesting story, and on a different podcast, we could dive into to the topic of doing things doing risky things that ultimately catapult your career. Because I had an idea for a program very early during the formation of the Center for Corporate Governance. I thought to myself, because I would go to these board programs and I'd hear directors say, we'd love to put a woman on the board, but gee, we just can't find any. Or we'd love to look for an underrepresented minority, but they aren't out there in our industry. They don't exist. And of course, I knew better because as a partner in Deloitte, I was interacting with very, very high caliber folks that are clients every day, any one of which would have been, I think, a perfect fit for a board. It's just they weren't traveling in those circles, and they certainly weren't CEOs. And we listened to boards say, you just can't replace a CEO. It has to be someone who has operating experience, and that's why we want sitting CEOs. So, there was a lot of that. So I had this idea of, hey, we have access to a pool of wonderful, talented senior executives that are clients who would make great board members, and we have access to directors on boards. Why don't we put those folks together and try to help prepare people for board membership, at the same time enhancing their network and giving sitting board members an opportunity to meet some of these people, and in a very low pressure setting, of course. So I sent a note to Sharon Allen, who was our wonderful chairman of the board for Deloitte at the time. I think it was a paragraph long, basically saying, this is my idea. Would you be interested in helping me think this through? And I think after that email, we hosted our first event called Diversifying the American Board less than 6 months later, which in professional services firms, that's like lightning speed. To be able to launch something new like that in 6 months was really pretty amazing. But I think it demonstrated Sharon's commitment to this idea and our firm's commitment to championing diversity on boards. So we ran that program for over 10 years, and we had about 1,000 executives from our clients attend, and I should say executives and board members. And interestingly enough, one of the first search firms to join us in that effort was Ellig, which was Janice's prior firm. So I got to know Janice as part of that effort with Sharon Allen in very, very early days. And I always tell Janice that she was interested in this topic before it became a safe bet, when she was really putting her political capital on the line to go out and talk in the marketplace about gender parity on boards and the importance of diversity and inclusion in the C-suite. And so that's where I first looped up with Janice and have been very impressed with what she's done around board and senior executive diversity ever since. So that program, yes, go
I was
ahead.
going to say, Nicole, let's make sure we talk about that as well, because after 27 years at Deloitte, you actually were convinced to leave, right?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think it's one of the hardest things to do when you've been with a firm, especially a firm like Deloitte, where I really dedicated my life to the firm and to my clients, and I just absolutely loved the relationships that I had with my partners and with the wonderful people that I had the opportunity to work with. But I stepped back and I said, what do I really want to do now? At Deloitte, you're often given stretch assignments that last for a year or two, and then you move on to the next stretch assignment. So it just happened that I had one of those assignments come to an end, and really just had this opportunity to step back and think about, what do I want to do now? What do I want to do next? And I came to talk to Janice about that because I'm also interested in joining a board myself, and that sort of led us to this conversation about, could I help to accelerate this effort around board diversity, which of course, I couldn't possibly have been more excited about that. And that seed was planted, and I just couldn't shake it, and here I am. So I decided to retire from Deloitte and start this second career with the Ellig Group, and it's been a wonderful experience so far.
And let's put that into perhaps perspective, because you're on that, you just described as your second career, but it sounds like, and I'd have been surprised if this wasn't the case, with that background and experience that you've got from being a partner at a firm like Deloitte, plus all the network that you built over those years, the opportunity for board roles, and you've got tons of nonprofit board experience already.
Yeah.
It would probably be instrumental for audience to hear about how you are thinking about yourself, to planning that, probably a campaign, if I want to call it that, to get that board seat for yourself. Let's just, for simplicity's sake, we're targeting a large public company board for which you'd be a great background and profile. How would you go about doing that? I think that'd be instrumental for our audience to hear.
Well, of course, I spent a lot of my time when I was running the board diversity program at Deloitte talking to people about this very effort. But it's a lot different when you're doing it for yourself. So I'm learning as I go. But I will say, one of the things that I always counsel people at the beginning of their journey to find a board, and that I'm doing myself, is to do some soul searching. What are the things that you're passionate about? What are the industries or the issues or the initiatives that you really want to spend your time focusing on? And kind of work backwards from there, because I think what people sometimes forget is, this is a real job. You're going to invest a lot of your time into serving on a board, and it should be something that fills you up, especially at this stage of your career, where you wouldn't even be considered for a board if you weren't hugely successful in your chosen career. So it should be about joining a board where you feel like you're making a difference on something that matters to you. And I don't mean that it has to be a mission-driven organization. I just mean it should be in an industry or focused on an issue or a challenge that you're passionate about. So for me, I've been spending some time really thinking about that, and picking some industries that I want to explore further. And I think that's been a fun exercise, because as you go through the next career, when you reach the pinnacle of your career and you're looking at what you want to do next, you really should be thinking about, how am I going to be spending this very limited resource, which is time.
The only resource we can never get back, right? It always continues
That's
to march
right.
forward. And I will give you the advice that I give to some other people of, when I think about a board role, let's say I'm planning for my next one, I want one where I'm 50% perfectly qualified to have all the background experience, but the other 50% is avenue for growth, room for opportunity for me to learn, because that'll be interesting, that'll be exciting. Hopefully it's sort of a passion fit with a subject that I love, probably financial services or fintech, something like that, because that's my jam. And I think for a lot of people, they can wrap their head around that second part. Yeah, I'm going to grow and develop, but you've of course got to have that first part. Why would, maybe it's the audit committee, right? Would be a natural fit for yourself, something like that within a firm or an industry you're excited about. Because for so many people, we have to realize that boards are never going to bring us on because we're generalists and we're smart and we're going to learn how to do it. They bring you on because probably you know the right people, you know the industry, you've got all the background and experience. Perhaps you have the right cachet from some of the organizations you've worked with. And I imagine you're probably giving advice like this to people that you're counseling. If you have perhaps a new client who's coming to you saying, Nicole, help me figure out how to do this, what are the first couple of steps you tend to walk them through?
Right. Well, first of all, let me just comment on what you said, because I think that is so perfectly put. I do think that it is important that you find a board role that plays to your strengths, but I love the idea of looking for something that also gives you opportunities for growth, because that is so important. I love that, so thank you for sharing. So when people start this process, what do I advise them? I think the first piece of advice that I often give is to really clean up and tighten your board bio. And I know it's a little mundane and no one really wants to do it, but it's really important. I think people overestimate by a factor of probably 10 how much time they have to make an impression when they're being considered for a board role, and they're being presented not just by a search firm, but by the nominating committee against other candidates. You don't have 3 pages worth of time to tell them what's special about you, what's interesting about your background, and how you're going to apply that to this particular board. So I do think it's really important to have a tight, short one-pager, and to focus on just a couple of things that get the points across as to what makes you special and different. So it's a little boring, but it's really important. And so I would encourage people. I'll give you a funny story, because the second thing I say is, once you think you have it there, then reach out to directors that you know and senior people that you know, not to say, here's my bio, get me on a board, but to say, take a look at this and tell me, what do you think? You see a ton of these, right? So I did that, and I sat down with the CEO of a large company that I've known for many years, very successful woman on a number of boards, and I handed it to her, and she handed it right back and said, I'm not even going to look at it, it's way too long. And it was one page, but it was a very dense one page. She said, you kept it to a page, but you missed the point. Go back and cut half of it. And that's what I did. But I think that's an important next step and it gives you a good reason to activate that network, because that's so important. Meet with every person you know who could potentially give you a foothold towards a directorship. And having a new bio to talk to them about, to say, give me some guidance, what are you missing? I went to a workshop. Deloitte hosted workshops around this still does actually, host workshops for clients and also retiring partners on developing your board bio. And I loved that we all sat around and did an introduction first and then looked at each other's bio, because people would say, well, in your introduction you talked about the fact that you did this and that. I don't see that at all in your bio. I think you should pull some more of that in. So getting that kind of feedback from people, I think, is helpful, but it also gives you an excuse to activate your network, which is, as you know, I'm sure, critically important in this process.
I love the way you've described doing it, right? Because I think for many people, we can imagine, okay, I might do the whole exercise and figure out who all the right people in my network and I could call. And probably the way we envision is, okay, I'm going to call someone. I'm going to say, I'd love 5 minutes of your time. I haven't talked to you in a few years, but here's what I'm doing now. I'm looking to land a board in this sort of industry, doing this sort of role. Here's my bio. If you have any opportunities, please keep it in mind and think of me. And that might work. But the way you've described it is wonderful, because people love to give feedback, and you've gotten valuable feedback, but at the same point, you've also done the great job of updating them in your network and what you're looking for. So I think that was brilliantly well placed.
Yeah. And I think networking as a sort of an effort, it takes a lot of different forms. And I like to tell people that I think I'm sort of an Olympic level networker. And they say, oh, I hate networking. I'm like, how can you hate networking? It's really just, sitting down and talking to interesting people. And if you don't have an agenda, that's even better. I can't tell you how many interesting conversations that I've had with people have taken when we sat down without an agenda. So I do ask people to be careful about, if you're going to reach out to your director network, be careful about putting a huge agenda around the meeting. of, hey, I want you to help me get on this board or that board or your board. The kind of networking that I've seen work well for board level roles is a little bit less structured than that, and it's a little bit more about, tell me your story. How did you find the boards you're on? What can I learn from that? I think that's a more effective way to network when you're looking to join a board.
I think that's great advice. And Nicole, when you sort of get other people coming to you and saying, great, I've done some of these basics, I've got the bio, I've done the board resume, and okay, I'm serious about it now. I understand the time commitment. I'm ready to go and take it forward. There's an expectation setting that happens, right? You do hear these amazing stories about someone who immediately networks in. I just heard about someone who landed a board seat at Coca-Cola at age 37. Not the norm. Help people to get a sense for the advice that you sort of give. Do you say, okay, you're going to take 3 years and you have these sorts of conversations, you're going to build this platform, become a position of authority, and then it will happen? How do you help people plan it through?
Yeah, it does take time. I just met with a wonderful woman this morning who's starting the journey, and I could sense her frustration. And I helped to recalibrate her expectations, and I said, this takes time. It certainly has happened where you just in the right place at the right time, but more often than not, it takes time. Even once you're being considered for a board role, it takes a long time to get through that process. So that alone can take 8 months or more, right? And that's once you've even been identified. So patience is an absolute virtue. For this person, I recommended she doesn't have a lot of not-for-profit board experience, and I don't usually tell people that you will find a board by being on a not-for-profit board. Again, it happens. That's not really the reason to do it, but I do think it gives you some really interesting experience that you can then use when you're looking for a corporate board. And I'll give you an example. Twice now I have led the CEO succession committee for not-for-profit organizations. They weren't huge organizations, but they were very prestigious in their own right. And I'll tell you, that gave me an experience that I will absolutely draw upon if I'm ever in that situation with a corporate board. So I suggested to her, maybe think about joining a not-for-profit board, but again, something that you're passionate about, something that you're really interested in, not because it's going to lead you directly to a board, but it will give you skills that you can then leverage when you're talking to a corporate board.
I would echo that advice. So picking up the skills are important and perhaps also rounds out the resume a bit. But especially if you're joining a nonprofit board, I think the passion is key. So you could try to network to what you think is the most prestigious board, let's say the Metropolitan Museum of Art or something like that, whatever in your town would be the board to join. And that could be great. But if you're not passionate about what they're doing, you're not going to bring your A game to that board. And the people around the room are going to be seeing you, and they're going to be having their own network and the ability to share them. If you join a board that is something you're going to do the best at and you're going to enjoy it, I think that's going to propel you forward in your career.
That's right. I agree with that. But, in a word, it's patience. You just have to be patient and, do your diligence, do your work, activate your network, get out there. Keep coming back, but understand it takes time. And that's why we often tell people, you should start this process 2-3 years before you think you might really want to find a board, because it takes time, and that's really what we try to tell people is if you think you're going to retire in 10 years and you want to join a board in 3 or 5, you should be looking right now, for sure.
Great advice. Nicole, it was a pleasure having you on the show today. Thank you for imparting all of your wisdom from the 27 years at Deloitte and launching their Center for Corporate Governance. And it's great to hear what you're doing, accelerating board diversity now with the Janus Ellig Group. And we were thrilled to have you sharing with us today and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
Well, thank you. It was my pleasure.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Nicole Sandford. It was great to hear from someone who has had a 25-plus year career with one of the most prestigious professional services firms in the world. And she helped launch Deloitte Center for Corporate Governance, which means she was thinking about all of this space, she was playing in this space, and she's been working with the leading organizations and the thinkers in the world, and she brought all of that to us today. Great information, and if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will get links to all of the resources that we talked about today. Now, please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.